When Mark Ruffalo stepped onto the set of The Steve Harvey Show, there was a familiar warmth in the studio. The audience was expecting laughter, charming shyness, and perhaps a few Hollywood stories. Steve Harvey was ready with his usual energy, witty and sincere. But when Mark sat down and noticed the cross around Steve's neck, the atmosphere changed. It was as if the air inside had slowly grown heavy. A conversation that would go beyond a talk show was about to begin. Because in the next few minutes, Steve wouldn't just be the one asking questions, he would also be the one shaken by the answers. What Mark was about to share would not only change his life, but also the hearts of many. And it all began with an unexpected sentence. Can I tell you something I've never told anyone before? Oh, before we start, you're reading the comments, aren't you? Seeing those reactions is very valuable to us. As the crowd settled into their seats, the lights began to dim. The feeling was more like a moment of inner peace than the energy of a television show. Steve Harvey's music faded into the background, along with his familiar smile. He held cards in his hands, but his face was filled with more sincerity than the cards. Tonight was different. Steve knew it from the very first moment. It wasn't about entertainment. There was something more, like a prayer in the air. His voice was emotional during the introduction. He presented Mark not just as an actor, but as a soul who could touch the hearts of the audience and empathize with them. The media says he's one of the most sincere people in the industry, he said amid applause. On the internet, they call him the kind-hearted Hulk. Me? I think he's the living embodiment of human grace. When Mark Ruffalo took the stage in his simple style, the audience gave him a standing ovation. He was wearing blue jeans, a gray shirt, and a simple jacket. There was no showmanship, just reality. He waved and greeted the audience with a shy smile. The intensity of the attention made him a little embarrassed. When Mark sat down next to Steve, the atmosphere in the studio changed again. The glitz of the show faded away, replaced by a deep sense of reality. There was no rush, no showmanship, just humanity. Mark paused for a moment before speaking, as if not wanting to disturb the calm atmosphere. He sincerely thanked the audience, then admitted with a slightly embarrassed smile that he always felt a bit unprepared when greeted like this. "I'm just a man trying to do his best," he said. Steve leaned in slightly and smiled. "That's what makes you special," he said. The conversation moved beyond movies to the essence of being human. It was about living without armor, about being vulnerable in a world that forces you to protect yourself. Steve talked about how Mark had remained the same despite his fame. He mentioned the people he gave his seat to on the subway, how he helped everyone on set, and how he shared his earnings with the crew. Mark nodded in agreement, but he didn't present it as something to be praised. "For me," he said with a slight shrug, "it's just the right thing to do." His voice was unassuming, but the meaning behind it was profound. He spoke so naturally, so simply, that there wasn't a single murmur in the studio. "Everyone has a struggle inside them," he said slowly, "and sometimes a small act of kindness can make someone's day." Steve bowed his head, truly moved, because all these words were coming from someone who, despite his fame, had not taken on a different persona, a man who hid nothing behind a facade. When the conversation turned to the fine line between success and humility, Steve asked, "Having achieved so much, how have you managed to stay so genuine?" Mark paused briefly before answering, "I guess I never believed anything is permanent, especially when it comes to people." His eyes drifted off into the distance, as if he were reliving a past pain. "I've lost a lot in life, loved ones, some of them too soon." There was a moment of silence. Then he added, "Those losses make you question everything. What you have doesn't make you superior. It just makes you more careful." He paused. His thoughts wandered a bit further. "My childhood was spent moving around," he said. "Wisconsin, Virginia, then New York. The place I called home changed a lot. My father left us when we were very young," Mark said, his voice trembling slightly. "My sister battled leukemia as a child. I lost my partner and a child of my own." Those last words echoed through the room. Everyone was frozen. "And yet here I am," he added, "because every day is a choice. Pain either hardens you or makes you more compassionate." The weight of his words settled over the studio. It was raw, unfiltered truth. The audience listened in silence, some seeming to hear echoes of their own pain. Steve's hand slowly moved to the cross on his chest. At first, he said nothing. His finger lingered on the small symbol, as if he felt it held an answer he'd been keeping there for years. Finally, he spoke softly. "You talk about silence as if you know it very well." Mark bowed his head, nodding slowly. "Yes, silence has been with me for a long time. Sometimes it's more honest than words, and in that silence, I hear the clearest things." Steve paused for a moment, then lowered his voice. "Have you ever heard God's voice in that silence?" The question caught Mark off guard. He paused for a moment before lifting his eyes to Steve. Then he looked at him. "Yes," he said. "I believe in something greater. I've questioned it for years, sometimes strayed. I've been very lonely, but in that loneliness, it was there, always. Not loud, but deep. Not comforting, but real." Steve's fingers clenched around the cross. "That belief," he whispered, "even if you can't name it, even if you can only feel it." Mark looked at the cross now. His expression changed. He leaned forward slightly, a tremor in his voice. He took a deep breath. "Steve," he said softly, "can I tell you something I've never told you before?" Steve didn't respond. He just nodded. Mark exhaled slowly. "There was a night," he began, "a time when darkness consumed me. I couldn't move, I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, and sometimes I wasn't even sure if I wanted to live. Everything was numb. There was no sound in the studio. Everyone was just listening. listening. I was scrolling through my phone trying to distract myself. In that emptiness inside me, I was trying to find something. And then I came across a video. You were talking, Mark said, his voice deepening, about purpose, about faith, about how God never wastes pain. Steve didn't move. He looked as if he was hearing his own words for the first time, coming from someone else's heart. Mark continued, but it wasn't just what you said. It was how you said it, as if you had lived it. At that moment, you were wearing that cross on the screen. He nodded slowly. I remember thinking to myself, this man believes in something bigger. Maybe I can too. Steve turned his head and looked at the cross on his chest. His fingers gripped it tightly. Mark's voice slowed. I watched that video 3 times, Steve. He took a deep breath, the words coming out slowly. And the next morning, maybe for the first time in weeks, I got out of bed. His shoulders slumped slightly, as if he were carrying the weight of that moment again. I never told anyone, he said, but ever since that day, your words stayed with me. They held me. Steve was silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. I just spoke from the heart, he said. I didn't know it would reach anyone. Mark smiled gently. That's exactly why it did, because you didn't do it on purpose. You didn't say it to prove anything. In that moment, you were just you, and that saved me. Steve's eyes filled with tears. The light softly touched the tears streaming down his cheeks. And that cross, Mark said, not taking his eyes off him. It's not just a symbol, it's a sign, a message. Steve looked at him in astonishment, but with an open heart. Mark bowed his head slightly, his voice slow but clear. You may think of yourself as just a faithful comedian, Steve, but I think you're so much more than that. Steve's eyes widened. He listened silently. Mark smiled, but there was a deep seriousness in his expression. I think you're a priest in disguise. There was a moment of silence. Steve just stared, filled with emotion. Mark continued, and there's something else I need to tell you. Something that might change your life, just like you changed mine. There was a deep silence in the studio. Real silence. Even the camera sound seemed to stop. Steve didn't take his eyes off the cross. Then just one word slipped from his lips. I'm listening. Under the lights, the stage no longer felt like a television studio, but like a sacred place. It was there not for laughter, but for the truth to be heard. Mark leaned in closer to Steve. His eyes were sincere, his voice soft but firm. There's something I've never told anyone before, Steve, he said. And Steve, a man who was surprised but open-hearted, just nodded silently. Mark leaned back slightly and adjusted his position in his chair. It was as if he was preparing to open a dusty door that had been closed for a long time. The studio was silent. The audience held their breath. Not a whisper, not a stir, just pure attention coming from the heart. Mark took a deep breath. His eyes didn't wander. They were fixed on Steve, but his expression looked much further away, to a time long ago. There was a time in my life, he said, a time when I forgot why I woke up in the morning. Steve didn't move, but his body was bent forward like his soul. I lost people, Mark said, not just to death, but to life, to time, to distance, to pain, one by one, silently. His voice was slow but deep, each word seeming to come from the depths of memory. My daughter was stillborn. The room fell silent. And a few weeks later, I lost Jennifer. She was like home to me. He paused. He looked at his hands for a moment. The strange thing is, I don't think I cried right away, because grief doesn't always come like a scream. Sometimes it's so quiet that you forget you're even alive. The audience listened without moving. Some leaned forward slightly, others turned inward. Mark continued, I kept working. I went to interviews. I acted. Because being yourself when you're broken is sometimes harder than hiding behind a character. Steve's hand slowly went to his chest. The movement was no longer a gesture, but a reflex, instinctive, like seeking shelter. Mark continued in a lower tone. But then, even the noise of the outside world couldn't drown out the silence inside me. And one night, that silence almost won. Steve bowed his head, his eyes fixed on Mark, as if searching for the next words. It was night, Mark said. I was alone. I hadn't slept for days. I hadn't eaten. I hadn't spoken to anyone. I didn't want to be anything. I just sat there in the dark. I didn't pray. I didn't think. I just stood there in the heavy silence that remained after all thoughts had ceased. His voice cracked for a moment. Then he took a deep breath. And then I picked up my phone. I wasn't looking for anything. I just wanted to feel nothing. As I mindlessly swiped through the screen, a video popped up. It was you. Steve blinked, surprised but sincere. Mark was still there, but his voice was now a witness from the past. You were on stage, Mark said, his voice soft but full of emotion. You were talking about storms, losses, but most of all, you were talking about how God doesn't waste pain. And you said that sometimes what breaks you is actually what opens you up. Steve shook his head slowly. The familiar light of that moment appeared in his eyes. He remembered. I don't know why I stopped scrolling, Mark said, but I stopped. I watched it all. Then I watched it again. His voice trembled. If you're still breathing, God isn't done with you, you said. A brief silence. And that sentence, it felt different to me, like someone had finally seen seen me. Not the actor, not that man, the real me, standing still in the dark. Steve took a deep breath. His hand was still on the cross on his chest. Mark leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. His voice was almost a whisper. "And I want you to know, Steve, that night I got up." He paused for a moment. "Not because I was healed, not because I found the answers all at once, but for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. And that was enough for me to get up." His words cut deep into Steve. He didn't hide it. His eyes filled with tears. His lips trembled. Mark looked at him with a gaze filled with respect and gratitude. "I didn't intend to tell this story," he said, "but here, sitting in front of you, I felt I had to." Steve's voice came out with difficulty. "My friend, I don't know what to say." Mark shook his head slightly. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "You already said it years ago." Then he pointed to Steve's chest with his finger. "That cross, that was the first thing that caught my attention." He paused for a moment. "Before your words, before the message in the video, that symbol was like a lighthouse to me. It was the first thing that drew me in." Steve's eyes returned to the cross. He clenched his hand tighter without even realizing it. Mark continued, "For the next few days, I watched the same video over and over again, not because it healed me, but because it reminded me that healing doesn't always start with answers, just with hope." The audience was still silent. Some had tears in their eyes. A few wiped them away. Others just sat and listened. Steve leaned back, took a deep breath. His throat was tight. Mark continued, "You think you're just talking, just making people laugh, just trying to survive." He raised his head. "But that night, Steve, you did so much more. You lifted someone who didn't have the strength to stand up. You lifted them up." Steve closed his eyes for a moment. The weight of those words filled him. Mark continued slowly, "I had to tell you this because the world knows you as a host, a comedian, or a motivational speaker. But I don't think that's entirely accurate," Mark said slowly. Steve looked at him, still affected and a little surprised. "I think," Mark paused, "you're a secret priest." There was a long silence. Steve's eyes filled with tears again. He shook his head slightly. It wasn't a denial. It was more like he was struggling to believe it, a humble disbelief. Mark took a deep breath. "Have you ever thought about why people are so drawn to you?" Steve smiled slightly as if confessing. "I've always wondered," Mark nodded with a sincere smile. "Because people don't just hear your voice, Steve. They feel your soul. You carry something sacred inside you, my friend." Steve let out a short, quiet laugh. "I'm just trying to be like everyone else," Mark replied without looking away. "And that's why you're real. Because you're not trying to be someone else. That's why you can reach people you'll never even meet." Then he turned his gaze to the audience. "The people here, the people on the other side of the screen, people like me, people sitting silently in the dark." Then he turned back to Steve. "And sometimes it's hard to carry that burden. Not knowing if what you're doing matters. It's hard." Steve bowed his head but nodded in agreement. He was visibly moved. Mark softened his voice. "That's why I came here today, to tell you that it matters." At that moment, there was an emotional peak in the studio. Mark's expression suddenly became more serious, more deeply determined. He leaned forward. His voice grew even quieter. "Steve, carrying that cross, it's not just a symbol. It's a sign, a message. And tonight, there's something I need to tell you. Something that could change your life." His eyes glistened slightly. "Just like you changed mine." Steve's expression changed. His eyes widened in surprise. The crowd noticed, and the energy in the room deepened. Steve asked softly, "What do you mean?" Mark didn't blink. "I've been carrying these words inside me for years," he said. "And tonight, I need to give them back to you." Steve was frozen. He sat motionless, but his soul was trembling. Mark shook his head slightly. "Because I think you might have forgotten their power." The weight of that moment hung in the air. Steve's eyes were locked on Mark. Mark leaned forward, his voice soft but determined. "I need to say these words to you again tonight, because maybe you've forgotten how powerful they are." The studio fell silent. Mark sat up straighter. He took a deep breath, as if preparing to relive a sacred memory. Even the background noise of the camera equipment in the studio had faded away. "I remember that video," Mark said slowly. "The lighting wasn't perfect. It was a bit grainy. You were on stage, one hand holding the microphone, the other on your chest, resting on that cross." Steve nodded slightly. Something was stirring inside him. Mark continued, "But it wasn't so much what you said. It was how you said it. In that moment, it wasn't like you were on stage. It was like you were in the middle of your own story. The words weren't memorized. They weren't polished. They were real." He paused for a moment. "You said pain has a language," he said, "and someone who speaks that language reaches straight to the heart. It cuts through the noise and gets to the core." He looked into Steve's eyes. "Then you said a sentence. I still remember it." His eyes moistened. "God doesn't always call the qualified. He qualifies those he calls." Steve's lips parted. His hand went to the spot Mark had described, the cross on his chest. Mark raised his voice slowly. "You said God can use ordinary people for extraordinary things." He bowed his head slightly and smiled. "And at that moment, you probably thought you were just joking. Maybe you were trying to pay the bills. Maybe you were worried about making it through the next day. But God was using you to change someone's life." Steve leaned forward. He rested his elbows on his knees. "That old video, recorded years ago after a show, unplanned but coming from the depths of his soul, came back to him. And I," said Mark, "realized that day, it wasn't just what you said. It was the way you said it. It shone like a star. I could feel your belief. And that belief reignited something that had been extinguished inside me." He looked down for a moment. His voice softened. stiffened. I had lost my way. Grief, silence, everything had obscured my compass. He raised his head, his eyes locked onto Steve's. But when I heard those words and saw the way you said them, I remembered. Even in my darkest moment, I wasn't invisible. He fell silent. His words settled slowly on Steve. You were a stranger to me, Steve, but in that moment, you were a light. Steve exhaled a long, suppressed breath from his chest. The weight of years was in that breath. Mark smiled gently at him. That's the thing about lighthouses, he said. They don't know who's watching them, but they keep shining. There was a moment of silence, not an awkward silence, a full silence, a space filled with what had been said and what was still echoing inside but hadn't been put into words. Then Steve spoke. His voice was much softer, more heartfelt. Sometimes, he said, I wonder if I've done enough. This comedy, these conversations, do they really mean anything? Mark leaned forward slightly. There was determination in his eyes, grace in his voice. They do, he said. I'm living proof of that. Steve nodded. His eyes were brimming with emotion. I was just trying to survive, my friend, he said. I never intended to save anyone. Mark nodded and smiled. That's why you did it, Steve. A slight stir rose from the audience. The silence was now broken by small, emotional sounds. Some wiped their eyes, others simply sat and watched with deep respect. Steve turned first to the audience, then to Mark. You said something changed in you when you watched that video, he said. What changed? Mark paused for a moment, thinking. Then he answered with a single word. Hope, he said. Maybe that silence wasn't the end of my story. Maybe, just maybe, God still had a purpose for me. His eyes turned back to Steve. When you spoke of divine purpose, I saw the cross on your chest. It wasn't a coincidence, Steve. It was a confirmation, a silent sign reminding me that the light can even pass beyond the screen. Steve's eyes lit up. He took a deep breath. He shook his head slowly. Mark bowed his head slightly. You reminded me that I wasn't forgotten. You reminded me that my story wasn't over. There was a moment of silence. Mark lived in that moment. He took it all in. And I remember every word you said, Steve, for years. And tonight, I need to tell you again, because maybe you've forgotten how strong you are. Steve looked at him. There was both gratitude and a question in his eyes. Mark took a deep breath. He spoke without looking away. Sometimes it's not you who's being saved. It's you who's doing the saving, and you don't even realize it. Steve's lips trembled slightly. Mark continued. You think you're just talking, but actually, you're bearing witness. Mark leaned back. He remained silent for a moment, overwhelmed by the moment. Steve brought his hands to his face. It was as if something was seeping out not from his eyes, but from his heart. Then he lifted his head. His eyes were shining. Do you remember everything? He asked. Mark nodded. I had to remember, he said simply, because I didn't just listen to you, Steve. You lifted me up. Steve leaned back slowly. His hands were clenched together, as if he were trying to hold himself up in that moment. And the studio had changed once more. This was no longer a stage. This was a place of healing. Under the lights, two souls touched each other. Mark's voice was heard again, this time softer, deeper. Maybe you don't hear this often enough, but Steve, you matter. Not because of what you've done, but for who you are. He continued without looking away. You brought hope back to places where people had lost it, including me. Steve couldn't respond. His chest rose and fell slowly. Their breaths had become the rhythm of their emotions. Silence enveloped the studio. Everything and everyone had stopped. Then Mark spoke in a voice almost a whisper. And today, just as you changed my life, I'm going to say something that could change yours. Steve slowly raised his head. In that moment, the entire studio held its breath. The cameras were rolling, but no one seemed to notice them. For a long time, Steve didn't say a word. It was as if he was absorbing everything Mark had said, the gratitude, the testimony, the raw truth. Then Mark leaned forward, this time not like an actor or a guest, but like someone about to convey a revelation from within. His voice grew even softer. That message, I remember every word, and now I want to tell you again, not just to remind you, but like a mirror, to show you who you are. Steve's eyes never left him. His gaze was fixed, his face filled with emotion. Mark began to speak calmly. God doesn't always choose the strong or the perfect. Sometimes he chooses the broken, the ones no one expects, because they know how to reach hearts the strong can't touch. Steve slowly blinked his eyes. The words hit him like a wave, sinking in without resistance. Mark continued. You don't need a pulpit to preach. You don't need a robe to be called. You don't need a church to spread your message. His voice no longer trembled, because at that moment, he wasn't quoting someone else. He was conveying a message. Sometimes your pain becomes your service. Sometimes comedy is the disguise God uses to give people hope. Steve's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out, because he was shattered. His defenses had fallen. Mark looked at him, not as if to flatter him, but as if to reveal an inner truth. You thought you were just making people laugh, Steve, but you were doing so much more. You were reaching hearts. You were saving lives. You were carrying the light. He paused for a moment to let his words sink in. Then he spoke the words that would shatter Steve's composure. You're a priest, Steve. You just wear a suit instead of a cassock. Steve's head dropped. One hand slowly moved to his face, the other to his cross. Tears were now flowing silently but freely. There was no shame. There was was no restraint. There was only surrender. The audience didn't move. There was no applause. It was a sacred silence, and he was still there. Mark lowered his voice a little more, almost to a fragile tone. Carrying that cross, it's not just a symbol, Steve. It's a sign. And I believe that tonight, that sign is pointing to something bigger than the two of us. Steve raised his head. Tears were still flowing, but there was peace within him. Mark, on the other hand, seemed to be preparing himself for that moment. He took a deep breath because what he was about to say wasn't just words, it was a transformation. Because tonight, I have something to tell you. Something that could change your life, Mark said, his voice still soft but heavy with meaning. Steve's expression changed. He looked at Mark with a look of admiration mixed with surprise and a hint of fear. Mark leaned forward, his voice quiet but determined. Just like you changed mine. Steve slowly lowered his hand from his eyes. His fingers were trembling. The tears hadn't completely stopped, but there was now a calmness within him, a softness in the light, a sense that time had slowed down. Mark sat silently across from him, as if waiting for the right moment to speak. Then he took a gentle breath and said, Steve, there's something I need to tell you. A sentence I've carried inside me for years. I've never said it out loud before. Steve shook his head slightly. His eyes searched Mark's for an answer. His voice was almost a whisper. Go on. Mark leaned forward. There was no actor on stage now. No role. Only pure reality. God uses his chosen servants, Mark began, even when they think they're just joking. Steve blinked but didn't move. Mark continued. You thought you were just trying to have fun, to bring a little joy to people. But Steve, you were saving lives. Another tear trickled down Steve's cheek, but this tear carried something else, an understanding, an acceptance. Mark nodded, his eyes saying, this is real. Then the words came in a whisper. You saved my life. No one in the studio was breathing. Time seemed to stand still. Even the cameras seemed to have bowed their heads in respect. Steve leaned back. The sound that came from his lips, was it a laugh, a sob, or something in between, was unclear. I was just trying to survive, my friend, he said, like everyone else, trying to get through my own pain. Mark nodded again. That alone makes it sacred. The words hung in the air. They didn't fade quickly, nor did they disappear. They were deep, echoing, and lasting. And then something unexpected happened. Steve slowly stood up. His body was trembling, but it wasn't from exhaustion. It was something else, a vibration coming from within. The effect of witnessing something sacred. He didn't speak. He simply touched his cross once more and looked at Mark. Mark didn't move. A moment later, he slowly stood up, his eyes locked on Steve's. Two men, one asking, one bearing witness, now stood face to face. Time seemed to stand still in the studio. Then Steve whispered a question, not out of doubt, but out of deep curiosity. Why me? Mark didn't hesitate. Without taking his eyes off him, he spoke as if addressing the light, not the darkness. I will tell you, he didn't rush. He carried the silence as if it were part of the speech. It was as if he were speaking not to the place where he was standing, but to the sky. Because God chooses the impossible, Mark said gently. Those who are overlooked, those who bleed silently behind the scenes, those who know how to listen to the pain of others, those who know pain. Steve asked, do you really believe we can still believe in such a world? Mark Ruffalo took a deep breath. His eyes were still fixed on Steve's. There was no actor's mask on his face, only the raw truth of a man. Yes, he said, I truly believe. The silence became almost physical. It was as if time had stopped in the studio, leaving only the echo of those words. Because faith is something without a script, Mark continued. You rehearse it in a movie. But in life you experience pain directly. And sometimes it's just a whisper, a prayer, a glance. But most of all, you find your way through the words of a stranger. Steve lowered his eyes. It was as if some of the weight he had carried for years had been lifted from his shoulders. Your word, said Mark, went beyond the screen, like the light passing through the glass and reaching my heart. That night, when I heard you speak, when I saw that cross on your chest, something changed. Steve raised his head, no longer feeling the need to hide his tears. Why me? He asked again. Mark took a step closer. His voice was soft, but carried the weight of thunder. Because God doesn't choose the perfect ones. He chooses the broken ones. Because broken people know where the light comes from. Some of the audience members in the studio bowed their heads as if in prayer. Others simply nodded in silence. Mark continued. And you, Steve, you didn't just make people laugh. You shone a light into their darkness. You didn't just stand on stage. You prayed, not with words, but with your very being. Not because you believed, but in spite of your pain. Steve's eyes welled up. He took a step toward Mark. The microphone seemed to stop recording. Hearts were recording. He chose me because, Mark began, his voice trembling, because someone like you, one person among millions, can change the heart of another million. And then Mark Ruffalo opened his arms. Steve Harvey hesitated for a moment, then touched the cross on his chest and walked toward him. They embraced. This wasn't a Hollywood moment. It was a divine moment. The audience slowly stood up. They didn't clap. They just stood there with respect, in silence. Steve took a step back, didn't even wipe away his tears. He took the microphone, his face close to the screen. "I've experienced a lot on this stage," he said, "but nothing has ever been as sacred as this moment. And if anyone needs to hear these words, it's you at the screen." He paused. He took a deep breath. "Let's pray," he said. Before the screen went dark, only one sentence appeared. "You may be broken, but God can still use you." Steve's question hung in the air like incense. "Do you really believe we can still have faith in a world like this?" Mark Ruffalo didn't answer right away. In a deep silence, his eyes locked onto Steve's. It was the kind of silence that comes before looking into your heart, as if the words had to be kneaded in his soul first, before they could flow from his lips. Finally, he spoke. His voice was calm, but the depth within it echoed. "I believe that faith is the only thing that's real." Steve bowed his head. He was listening, not like a TV star, but like a seeker. Mark continued, "In Hollywood, we follow scripts. Everything is planned. We rehearse pain. We fake joy. But faith, there is no director in faith. Faith demands truth. It demands surrender. And sometimes it shines like a candle in the middle of the darkness." His voice was softer now, but stronger. "Faith isn't flashy. It doesn't win awards. It doesn't get invited to parties. But it saves people. Quietly, deeply, forever." Steve's eyes were filled with tears. His heart was in his throat. He placed his hand over the cross on his chest. He didn't hold back his emotions. "Hollywood teaches us how to act," said Mark. "But faith teaches us how to live." A tremor ran through the audience. No one applauded. No one moved. Because this was not a show. It was reality. "Faith," added Mark, "is a path without spotlights, without cameras, without applause. It is loneliness. But in that loneliness, you and God are not alone." Steve closed his eyes. He nodded silently. "I wasn't raised in a religious family," Mark confessed, "but I've come to believe that faith is real because it wasn't preached to me. I found it in silence. When the lights went out, when no one else was there, someone was with me." He looked at Steve. There was more than light in his eyes. "And through you, he found me," he said. "Not the you in Hollywood, the real you, the wounded but still walking you." He paused for a moment. Then he stood up. Steve stood up with him. They looked at each other for a long time. "God bless your microphone," Mark said slowly, "because you speak from a place of pain. That's why people don't just watch you, they feel you." Mark opened his arms. Steve walked into them without hesitation. Two men, not an actor and a presenter. Two brothers embraced each other. The audience slowly stood up. There was no applause yet, because this moment was sacred. There was only silence. And in that silence, something was growing. A belief, a hope. Steve took the microphone. His face was red, but he stood firm. His voice trembled, but his heart was full. "I've experienced a lot on this stage," he said, "but this was the greatest gift I've ever received in my life." Then he bowed his head slightly, closed his eyes. He took a deep breath. When he opened his eyes, he spoke to the hearts of the audience. "Let's pray." And in that studio, in front of millions of people, two men carrying the wounds of life became the instrument of healing. And for a moment, the world believed again. If you're broken but still hold on to hope, write faith in the comments. Don't forget to share, because maybe you'll be the light that shines into someone else's darkness.